Today we're going to take a look at some of the various conditionals that you can use in PHP. Specifically for this lesson, I'm going to teach you about using if statements, switch statements, and then I will also teach you about creating your own lookups. So let's get started. I'll open my sites folder, and we're within our sandbox. I'm going to create a new folder called Conditionals, and we will drag this folder into Sublime Text. I will create a new file and call it index.php and open up a PHP block. So the first thing you need to understand is that a conditional requires a test. So we have statements that we would call an if statement, things like this. If this test returns true, then do something. But what happens if it returns false? Well, we could say otherwise or else do something else. So as you can imagine, this can be very powerful. If this test is true, then I want to proceed in this way. If it does not, then I want to proceed in another way. Imagine something like sending an email. If this email was successfully sent, then we want to echo out to the user, "Thank you very much for your email." But what if there's some kind of error? Maybe the user didn't enter some necessary information, or we simply couldn't send the email. Well, we don't want to just blindly say, "Thank you, we'll be in touch with you shortly." We need to give them some kind of feedback to let them know, hey, something actually went wrong, please try again. And conditionals are the way we can do this. Now, before we get right into this, you need to understand how you can actually run tests. So for example, we know that we can set a month equal to January, like this. So what we're doing here is we are literally assigning a value to a variable. But then there's this other option where we run month double equals January. And this means something very different. In the first case, we are assigning the value to the variable. In the second case, we are running a test. Does month equal January? Notice how I'm phrasing that differently. The first one, set month equal to January. And the second one, does month equal January? So we're testing whether the right side equals the left side. So let's try this out. Let's create our variable again, month equals January. And now within our test, for now, let's get rid of the else. You don't require an else, only if you need it. Our test is going to be, does month equal January? So we'll say if month double equals January, then do something. And we'll echo, it does. All right, let's save it like that and view it in the browser. I will switch over to Chrome and we'll go into Sandbox, Conditionals, and our index.php file, and we do see it does. And of course it does because we ran our test. Does month equal January? Yes, it does. Only on that condition does the contents here execute. But what if it doesn't? All right, well, let's see if we change this to February, then what will happen? Well, we come back and we don't get anything at all. And that's only helpful in some cases, but many times you need to provide some level of response based upon the results of that test. So we'll take advantage of else. Else, echo, not the right month. Reload the page, and now we are displaying information on the page based upon a test. Very cool. Now in this case, we are using a double equals, but you might be interested to find that there is a triple equals, strict equality. If you've done some JavaScript, this will be familiar to you. I'll give you an example of the differences, but it can be a little complicated, so don't fret if it's still a little blurry. You'll understand it the more that you go. Let's change this value to simply any string at all. I will write hello. Now, we are going to change this and test to see if it equals true. Well, what do you think is going to happen there? Let's reload the page and we get, oh, it does. But that's interesting because it doesn't actually equal true. If we'd set it to true, we would expect that. But it actually just equals a string. Well, as it turns out, with this double equals, we're not actually checking for the data type. We're simply saying, is this string a truthy value? And because it's not an empty string, that is truthy. There are characters there. It is a truthy value, so that does return true. I'll give you an example. If we remove this entirely, now month is equal to an empty string. Well, now if we come back, reload the page, we get not the right month, because now an empty string is a falsy value. And this is something you need to understand, the difference between truthy values and falsy values. But that does beg the question, well, what if we literally wanted to test if month equals true, including the data type, which is Boolean? Well, in that case, you would use strict equality. And many times you'll find that you use strict equality exclusively so you can be as explicit as possible. Now, if we come back, we get not the right month. Notice I remove it, it returns true, we add it on, now it's returning false, because this time, no, true does not equal the string hello, which is a truthy value, but the data type is not the same. If we wanted that to pass, we would have to make month equal to true, in which case now it does. Now, there are other ways to create truthy and falsy values besides just true and false. We've learned that a string that is not empty is truthy, and the same thing for numbers or integers. If I make month equal to 1, and we go back to the double equals, let's save that, reload the page, that is a truthy value, because is month, which is 1, truthy? Yes, it is. 1 or anything higher, I can make this 205, and that's still going to be a truthy value. But if I make month equal to 0, 0 is inherently a falsy value. 1 for true, 0 for false. Now, that's going to fail, and we get the else statement, which executes. Now, what's important to understand is that 0 specifically is a falsy value. It's not a matter of greater than 0 or less than 0. If I set this to -50, actually, that will pass. That's truthy. It's the fact that 0 specifically is a falsy value. So many times, as you get better in PHP, you'll start running tests. Is the output of this function greater than 0? And that's a way of saying, is it not a falsy value? So in this case, if we wanted to check to see if month was a falsy value, we would say equals false. Now it runs. Or we could literally say, does it equal false? Well, that's going to fail, right? Because false is not the same data type as 0. That's a Boolean, that's an integer. So in this case, we would literally check to see if month equals 0. Now it's passing. Or, as I noted before, we could say, if month is greater than 0, then echo it does. Otherwise, echo not the right month. So we'll try testing this out. Let's set month equal to 4. Yep, now it's working. So now we're using greater than. You could also use greater than or equal to. And this is a way of essentially saying if month is not a negative number. So that will work. Let's change it to 0. That will still say it does. But as soon as I go below 0, such as -1, that test will fail. Now, in addition to greater than or equal, you also have less than or equal. There's also this syntax right here, which is simply saying not. Don't ever use this one. Very few people do. You can also test to see if something does not equal. So we had this. Let's change this back to something more readable again. Here, we're saying, does month equal January? But if we wanted to say, does month not equal January? Then we can replace that with an exclamation point. And that's how we negate it. Now, which one do you think will be displayed on the screen? Reload the page, and it fails. Because is it true that month does not equal January? No, that is not true. Month does equal January, so this test fails, this never runs, and instead we run the else statement. Now, in the same way that double equals tested for a truthy value but not the same data type, the same is true for exclamation point equals, or you'll also hear people say bang equals or not equals. Again, if we change this to true and we run it in the browser, yep, that's going to fail because now we're saying, is it true that month is not a truthy value? No, that is not true. Actually, month is a truthy value. If we wanted to make that test pass, we would make this an empty string or something that's a falsy value. Reload the page, now it says it does. So if we want to do the same thing with triple equals, as we did before, but negating it, you would do bang equal equal. Reload the page, now it says it does. But if we make it equal to true, that will fail. There we go. So watch that again. That can be confusing at first. Try to wrap your mind around that idea of a truthy value. Just because we have a string, well, that can also be a truthy value. But that doesn't mean it is the data type of Boolean or true or false. So let's simplify things a little bit more because I know that can get confusing. Let's go back to what we had before. If month equals January, echo, it does. Otherwise, echo, it's not the right month. But what if you want to do a different test? If month equals January, we will say it is January. Otherwise, else, if month equals February, then echo, it is Feb. Finally, we do one last else, and you can stack these as many times as you want. So let's try it out. Reload the page, we do get it is January. Let's change it to February. Now we're getting it is February. And finally, if I change it to March, this test will fail. This test will fail, in which case we run the final else. And we get not the right month. Now coming back here, notice how I wrote else if. If you want, you can actually group that together into a single word, else if. Reload the page, we still get not the right month, but if we change it to February, and I do want you to note that it is case specific. So that passes, but if we were to capitalize the letter E, that is no longer the exact same string, in which case it's going to fail. So keep that in mind. So coming back to this, you can imagine that you could just keep stacking these. If month equals March, then do something else. And that will lend itself to very messy code. And there are better ways to handle this. So as a rule of thumb, do an if. You could do one else if, maybe in some cases even two. But as a best practice, if you're in this situation where you keep stacking else if, it probably refers to what we call a code smell, or an area where your code can be refactored. And what that simply means is redo your code, make it better, streamline your code so that it's more expressive. So I will show you a different way that we can write this code using a switch statement. So we can do this by writing switch and then the variable that we're concerned with. In this case, it's month. Now within here, we're going to do a handful of tests. And within a switch statement, we refer to those as cases. So for example, we could say for our first one, the case will be January. On the condition that month equals January, then do this. And in our case, we will simply echo, it is Jan. Now, the way that we tell PHP that if it is January to execute this code and then break out is we actually run a command called break. So PHP will execute all of the statements here until it gets to break, in which case it breaks out of this switch statement. But it's not required. There will be instances where you wanted to continue to the next case automatically, in which case you would leave off the break. But for now, don't let that confuse you. Just get in the habit of adding it on there until you can justify why you would leave it off. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Our next case will be if it is February. And in that case, we will echo it is Feb. And then that's all we're going to do for months, but how do we replicate this else statement? Well, we can't do anything like case else. That's not how it works. Instead, we would specify a default. And that would mean if none of these match, only on that condition should you execute the code within default. We'll add it right here, echo, not the right month. All right, so let's test this out. I'm gonna take our variable and just bring it down, even though we don't have to, just to make it a little bit more readable. And we load the page, we do get it is February. We'll change it to January. We get it is Jan. And if we change it to March, we get the contents of the default case. And of course, that's going to run for anything that is not January or February, that will run because it doesn't match any of the two we have above. But if we did add one, for example, right here, echo, and we'll simply write here. I'll save that, reload the page, and now that one has taken effect. So going back, let's get rid of that gibberish, and let's change it back to January. What I want you to note is if I did not have this break statement here, watch what's going to happen. Load the page, and we get it is Jan, it is February. So what's happening is we're running our switch, and we're saying, does month equal January? Yes, it does. So echo, it is Jan. And because there's no break, we haven't told PHP to stop. So PHP just keeps going. Now it's going to echo, it is February. If we were to add another one for March, and I've removed the break from the February, now it's going to continue on and add, it is March. But there's a break in February here, so now it will only do it is January and it is February. And if we add our break back on, because most of the time you only want to execute one thing, now it will only execute it is January. So now you've learned how to use if and if-else statements. You've learned how to use switch. I'll show you another way that we could actually do this. Let's take months and bring it down again, and we're going to use what we would call a lookup. So I will create a months array, and that's going to be equal to an associative array, which you learned about 2 lessons ago. And what we're doing here is we specify what we're checking and what should execute. And this is helpful when you only need to do one thing. You need to call a single function. You need to echo out a response, things like that. If you need to proceed with a handful of commands, no, you would not use a lookup like this. But just to give you an example, let's do that one. And if it's February, and finally, if it's March, it is March. Now, one thing that you'll find in terms of a best practice is PHP developers like to line up their equal signs and their arrows. So you'll often see people do this, and that's okay. It's not white space dependent. So now we have this months associative array, and we can simply echo months and then our variable. So in this case, it's the exact same thing as doing echo months January. I'll save it, view it in the browser, and we do get it is Jan. So this is a lookup. We contain our keys and our values, and then we simply echo out that array, and then we pass in the key that we need. Let's comment this out, uncomment the one before. Now the only difference is we're using the variable name, but the variable name equals January, so we're going to get the exact same thing. Now this works quite well when you can be certain that the value provided is going to be within the array. But watch what happens if month, maybe it's provided by the user and they enter gibberish. Well, now we run it and we're going to get this notice, undefined index. And what it's saying is you're trying to echo out a value within this array that doesn't exist. So of course you would get an undefined index. It doesn't know what it is, so it has nothing to echo out for you. So if you are still intent on using this method, and it has its upsides, but of course it has its downsides. And as a developer, it's up to you to decide when does it make more sense to use a switch? When does it make more sense to keep it simple and use an if statement, which arguably is the most readable? And when does it make sense to use a lookup? Anyhow, if you are intent on using this, you could use something called the ternary operator. And I'm not going to go over the syntax for the ternary operator just yet because we will review it in a future lesson. But just go along for the ride right now. We'll say if is set months, months, meaning if this item in the array exists, then echo months, month. Otherwise, notice that we're doing essentially if else. The ternary operator is essentially a shorthand way for doing that. And now we'll say not the right month. I'll reload the page, and now we're getting the same thing. Change it back to January, and that's working as expected. All right, so that's a little advanced for where you are at this point. File that away for future reference, though. Now I want to go back, and we're going to take a look at if statements just a bit more. So we'll create our month. This time it'll be May. And now I want to group two conditionals. If month does not equal May, notice this time I'm using bang equal equal to make sure that both the data type and the value do not match. So if month is not May and we can either write the word and, but it's more common to see developers use the shorthand, which is ampersand, ampersand. But just translate that in your head to and. So if month is not May and month is not June, then echo is not May or June. Very expressive, isn't it? All right, so now if I run it, we don't get anything because month does equal May. So you can think of each of these as their own test. We start on the left. Is it true that month does not equal May? No, month does equal May, so that fails. If it fails, it doesn't even bother running this because this will only pass if both of these sides equal true. So when it finds out, nope, that one failed, it knows, hey, I don't even have to worry about this one right here because regardless of whether that one is true or false, the test is still going to fail. And we'll say echo, it is one of those. So now I'll reload the page and we do get that. But if we change the month to January, well now both of those tests are going to pass because it's saying month doesn't equal May. Is that right? Yes, that is right. The next one, month does not equal June. Is that true? Yes, it is true. Now we run this. Now, in addition to doing ampersand, ampersand, we can also do or again, as PHP developers often do, they do pipe, pipe, and that means or. So now we're saying if, and we'll change it up, if month equals May or month equals June, we will say it is May or June. Otherwise, it is not one of those. All right, so what do you think is going to display on the page? Pause it. Now we'll take a look, and we get it is not one of those. Now the difference here is when we're using or, that's the way of saying the left side can be true or the right side can be true. Either one of those works, or they could both be true. Just as long as one of them is true, we will run this. But if neither are true, then we run this. So in this case, we got the else statement because it did the first test. Does month equal May? Nope, that one's not true. Well, now PHP is saying, okay, well that failed. Or let's try this other one. Does month equal June? Nope, that's false as well, so this never runs. Let's change it to June. Now, this one will fail, but this side will pass, in which case we do get it is May or June. And I'm going to leave it at that for now. So we actually took a look at a lot of new things, conditionals, if-else statements, using switch statements. You got your first peek at the idea of using lookups, which I would expect to be a little confusing, and that's okay. It should be confusing at this point. So the main things I want you to have a firm grasp of before you move on to the next lesson is the idea of using if statements and providing a test. If, and then we provide some test that will be either equal to true or false. Dependent upon the outcome of that test, you will execute some command, or you won't, or you will execute something else. You also should have a basic understanding of switch. It's okay if you forget the syntax. We're not going to be using it all over the place. But then again, it certainly has its place in the PHP language. So try to play around with this. And what I recommend you do is things like this. Run your commands. If, else, else, and then try to take that code and convert it to a switch statement. And if it is simple code, also see, can you be more clever? Can you create little lookups to make your code more readable and streamlined? And lastly, I want you to be comfortable with the idea of using ampersand, ampersand, or pipe, pipe to reference and, which you could do, or the keyword or. Okay, that's going to do it for this lesson. In the next episode, we're going to dive into the various loops that are available.